Our presentation today focuses on developing a deductive coding scheme using theory. And I know that folks are coming today from a wide variety of backgrounds and interests, and also experience and exposure to qualitative research methods. So I'm going to try to provide an overview that is inclusive of those different levels of experience with qualitative research. So this may be review for many folks, but the qualitative research process generally entails these steps listed here. First, conduct a literature review and oftentimes identify a theoretical lens that is going to guide your research. After you've done reading of the literature, you develop research questions and begin to design your study. Once you design your study, you need to seek ethics approval at least from Seton Hall University. And once you do so, then you can start collecting and processing your data. I know that there was a workshop a couple weeks ago about interviewing and that piece of collecting your data. So if you're interested in that, look out for that recording. But today we focus on the analysis piece. So the part that starts to happen after you collect your data and before you ultimately finalize your results and present them. So although this is the process, sometimes we see sort of a cycle between collecting data and analyzing data. So sometimes it's linear and sometimes we find ourselves sort of going back and forth. And it sometimes depends on our coding strategy. So that's one thing that we'll talk about today. So focus on analysis. So the things that I want you all to get out of our time today is to understand the difference between inductive coding, deductive coding, and blended coding strategies. So I want everyone to be able to leave and be able to articulate the benefits and limitations of inductive and deductive strategies. So we will talk about both. And we'll go through a mini example of a coding process, both inductively and deductively, to compare those and get a sense of what this is like. And really, ultimately, the goal is to increase your preparation for being able to do your own research. So our structure for the presentation today is that I'm going to go over some basics related to qualitative research and data analysis in particular. Then we'll do a mini coding exercise with excerpts from an actual interview. Then we will incorporate theory into that exercise and also talk about the role of theory in research. And at the end, I'll share some resources for further reading and further exploration if you want to continue to build your knowledge and understanding of this topic. So put yourself in the mindset of researcher. All of us here today are qualitative researchers, and we need to imagine that we are in this space making progress on our projects. And for some of you, that might be a reality, so it might not be that hard to imagine. But what I want you to come to this presentation today is sort of this lens of imagining that you are a qualitative researcher, you've begun the data collection process, you have tens, maybe hundreds of pages of data in front of you, whether interview transcripts or observations that you've made or notes that you've taken or documents. And now that we have this data, what do we do with it? Of course, the next step is data analysis. And although we say this easily, this is not an easy process. It's labor intensive and it's very systematic, and there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. So qualitative data analysis, the process of analyzing qualitative data, is essentially systematically breaking down data into parts that can be used to make interpretations about what is observed. So you as the researcher need to go beyond reporting the data and start to interpret it and make meaning of it. And always the goal of qualitative data analysis is to answer your research questions. Once you start to get all of this data, sometimes you get excited about it and you can start to get distracted from what your research questions are. But ultimately, the goal of any research project is to answer the research questions. So it's important to have those set from the beginning and to keep them in mind. I know for me, when I'm going through analysis, I write them on a sticky note and put them on the computer. So I'm constantly reminding myself of what to pay attention to because it can get away from you pretty easily. So when we engage in qualitative data analysis, what we are doing is coding. And this word or phrase might be familiar to you, especially for folks who have taken qualitative research classes. So a code within qualitative qualitative data analysis is essentially a word or a phrase that is assigned to a piece of data for the purpose of analysis. So the coding process in qualitative research looks like examining each sentence in your data, judging what it means, judging whether it's relevant, and then starting to make meaning of it and label data with a code or with a word or a phrase that represents that segment of data. And ultimately what you'll want to do is you will separate your data based on these labels that you've given or these codes that you've given to start to look for themes. So coding is a highly laborious process. It's very detailed. It requires a strong organization system. I know when you all registered for participating today, one person had written a question about qualitative software. And although that's a better question for Dr. Freitas's workshop in 2 weeks, I just want to say that qualitative analysis software does exist. It can help organize your analysis process, but whether or not you are using a software program, you, the researcher, are always doing the coding. It's always a manual process. Whether or not you choose to use software is essentially making the decision of whether you want to code with pen and paper or with a mouse and a screen and a software program. Either way, you, the researcher, are doing the work. So coding software can help you organize, but it doesn't really help you actually code. So although you might, as the researcher, collect your data, do all your interviews, the coding process still tends to bring up things that you missed somehow during the data collection process. So there are 3 major types of coding strategies when it comes to analyzing qualitative data: inductive coding, deductive coding, and a blended approach of the two. So inductive coding is a strategy in which the codes that you develop are coming directly from the data collected from your participants. So you are approaching an interview transcript fresh, with a blank slate almost, and starting to make meaning out of the data as you read it and as you go along. This is in contrast to deductive coding, in which the researchers use predetermined codes and fit their data into these codes. So in deductive coding, you are approaching that same interview transcript with a list of ideas in mind that you are looking for within the data. And then there's also blended coding, where researchers use some combination of the two. And I'll go into each of these in a little bit more depth in a moment. In conducting qualitative data analysis, your process is identifying.
You are muted, Professor.
Thank you, okay. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So,
yes.
Creating a code book is ultimately your goal in the coding process. So regardless of whether or not you are doing inductive coding, deductive coding, you need to maintain a code book, which is essentially a list of all of the codes that you are using within your data. So a code book is listing the code, listing a definition of the code, and also rules about when to apply a code or not to apply a code. So this is really meant to be a document that serves as a reference for you, and if you're working with others, for your whole team throughout the analysis process. And the goal is to maintain consistency and coherence throughout the process, because as you code a lot of data, you can start to think, you can start to be influenced by it and think that things mean different. You start to see different interpretations of some of the same ideas that you're coming with from the beginning. And so when you are coding inductively, you're developing a code book as you go along. You are identifying codes as you go along, and you are keeping a repository of them throughout the process. When you are using deductive coding, you're developing the initial code book before analysis even begins. So again, you are thinking about the ideas that you expect to see from your data, and then you're looking for those ideas when you start the process. All right, so inductive coding in a little bit greater depth is when you develop codes and your code book as you go along, as you read your data line by line. So in an inductive coding process, researchers go back and forth between their data and the code book until a comprehensive set of codes is established. So as you're reading, you are identifying segments of data and ideas that are coming out of your data, and you're keeping track of those. And this can get out of hand really quickly. There can be a lot, especially if you have a lot of data, there can be a lot that's coming out of it. So inductive coders are usually trying to strike a balance between a workable number of codes and also starting to capture the complexity and some nuanced ideas within the data. So oftentimes inductive coding is a process of identifying a lot of different ideas within your data, and it typically generates a long list of codes in a very long code book. And one of the references that I was reading in preparation for today sort of says that inductive coders might end up with between 50 and 70 initial codes because there's so many different ideas that are coming out of your data. Because there's so many ideas coming out, there are two cycles, and the second cycle is starting to create categories out of these initial long list of codes that are generated from within your data. So some of the pros of coding data inductively is that it's very loyal to the data. It reflects what's actually in there because you're not coming in with preconceived notions. It also captures the complexity because you are using this long list and generating new codes when new ideas come up. But because it's such an open process, it can also be highly complex and it can lack focus as well. So compare inductive coding to deductive coding. In deductive coding, you are approaching your analysis with a predefined list of codes that's created before you start coding your data. And these are also known as a priori codes. So in the process of deductive coding, your coding is focused on the issues that are known to be important. So most times, deductive codes are based on the theory that guides your work. You'll also see researchers use deductive codes to reflect themes that they generally see in the literature related to the topic that they are studying. So if I am studying community colleges, for instance, I might know that student demographics of folks who attend community colleges are different from those who attend four-year institutions, and that might be something that I'm looking for based on the literature, even if it's not an idea that's coming up out of the theoretical framework that I'm using. Because you're working from a set list of ideas, whether from your theory or from existing literature or both, there's usually only a small number of codes. So as opposed to coming up with new ideas as you go, you are approaching the data with a limited set of ideas, knowing what's already important related to your topic, and you are looking for evidence within your data that fits these ideas. That being said, there can be adjustments throughout the process, so it doesn't mean that you need to approach analysis with a strict list of codes and not deviate from that, but you do want to come in with a list of codes, and you can develop it as you go along, but you're usually working within some of the main ideas that you know are important. So the pros of deductive coding is that it is generally an easier process due to greater focus because you have that limited list, and anchors the study in the literature. It really focuses on the ideas that we already know are important based on the topic that you're studying. The cons, however, is that deductive coding may fail to capture new ideas in dynamics within the data. So because we're already working with a preconceived set of ideas, we may not capture new insights that are offered that don't align with the theoretical framework that you're using or the set of literature that you're using. So there is a third approach called the blended coding approach. And the reason why I talk about both of these is that even though the title of this session is deductive coding, the reality is probably all of you will do some type of blended coding approach. Okay, this is the most common. Usually you want to sort of strike a balance between inductive coding and deductive coding because of the rationales of both of them. We want to both make sure that we're capturing the important ideas based on the theory that guides our work and based on existing literature, but we also want to remain open to some of the new insights that can come out of our data. So I imagine that most folks will probably use a blended coding approach. And if you read qualitative research, you'll probably find that most researchers are using a blended approach, whether they say it explicitly or not. So when you use a blended coding approach, you kind of have to make the decision of how do you want to start? Do you want to start with the inductive coding or pulling ideas directly out of the data? Or do you want to start with deductive coding, which is approaching your data with some specific ideas in mind? And there are pros and cons to each. So starting with inductive coding really emphasizes the ideas that come directly out of the data. And then afterwards, you can incorporate theory and literature to make sure that these ideas are being represented and to see how they're being represented, because they might be represented in a different way than the theory might have told us originally. And if so, then your research probably has implications for what that theory might look like or how it should evolve. If you start with a deductive process, you give immediate structure and theoretical relevance from your analysis. And then if you do inductive coding later, you're also able to capture some of those insights that you might have missed because you were working with such a structured process. All right, so I want to do a mini coding exercise here, and I'll exit out of my presentation in just a second to share a Word document. But essentially, we're going to look at a very small interview excerpt, and we're first going to code it inductively. And then I'm going to give you a theoretical framework to work with, and we're going to code it deductively so that we can compare these two approaches. Well, let me exit out here. Any questions so far?
Dr. Smith, I have a question.
Yes, please.
So when I'm taking advanced qual this semester at Dr. Friedis, and one of our exercises was actually creating the code book. Based on your sort of experience, I think one of the issues that I ran into was we worked on open coding in class, so just going through all the data initially, like you said, and kind of creating all those codes from the start. Do you suggest making the code book with the definitions, examples, and non-examples while you're open coding, or just get all the codes first, and then when you do the second cycle is when you start plugging in definitions, examples, and non-examples?
I think you almost have to do it as you go along, because as you go along, you're making decisions about does this also fit the same code? And so because of that, you almost have to track the decisions that you make. And so it makes sense to do those simultaneously.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions at this point? Forgive the loud background. All right, so I thought I could share a Word document, and I could when there was only a couple of us, but it's not giving me that option now, but that's okay. We can still work with what's on the PowerPoint slides. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. All right. So the topic of the interview excerpt that we're going to look at is college choice. So the research question that we're answering as a group today is, how do undergraduate students decide where to attend college? Okay, so everybody here's in graduate school or higher, and you have all made decisions yourselves about college attendance. The sample for this study was of first-year undergraduate students at a private, highly selective institution. And within the excerpt, I use this acronym HSPI, which means highly selective private institution, to mask the institutional name. So because everybody's coming into this topic with some experience, I want you to take a moment and write down on a piece of scrap paper and open a document, just write down a couple sentences reflecting on your own positionality related to this topic. So this is something that qualitative researchers do prior to conducting their study, even prior to designing it often. And certainly it's something that we need to be attentive to prior to analysis. So take a minute to find a place to take notes, especially because you will need a place to take notes as we get further into this exercise, and reflect on your own positionality in regard to the topic of choosing a college. So you might want to think about your own college decisions, the decisions of family members, your children, students who you might work with, or any sort of assumptions about the process. So I'll give us just 2 minutes max to reflect on some of the assumptions that you have based on your own experience about college decisions. All right, so take a couple of more seconds to just sort of wrap it up. It's always helpful to think about the lenses and experiences that we bring into this process in which the researcher plays such a strong role as the instrument in qualitative research. So we're going to be working with a very, very small set of data. So keep this in mind that this is a caveat. This is, again, a tiny, tiny piece of data for the purpose of this exercise. All right, so what I have here is an excerpt from an interview, okay? And I'll read the excerpt out loud to you, but what I want everyone to do is to inductively code this. So to look for themes that stand out to you based on the data alone, okay? So this interview transcript, in which I will say that I did forever ago in my own introduction to qualitative research class, the interviewer asks the interviewee, so describe for me how you chose to come to HSPI. The interviewee, the first year student, says, you know, I was just applying to colleges. It's actually really funny. I was applying to all these different colleges, and then like my mom had really been pushing me to go to a selective public university. So I visited selected public university a lot. And then a couple days before the deadline, I was like, maybe I should apply to HSPI. I don't know. It sounds good. I looked at the essay prompts and I was like, oh, these are sort of similar to some of what I've done. So I threw in an application and somehow I got in. And then when I went and visited, I really liked it. So I just chose HSPI. Interviewer, do you remember what prompted you to think to apply to HSPI? Student, well, my college counselor had sort of recommended HSPI in similar colleges, like a different highly selected private institution or something like that. And I don't know, I was sort of scrambling in December trying to think like, oh, I want to increase my chances to get in anywhere since I want a good college. All of a sudden, HSPI just kind of popped in my mind. I was flipping through like a college book, like something like that, and I read up on it, and I was like, oh, that sounds pretty cool. Interviewer, all right, and what did you like about your visit to campus? Student, well, I loved the campus, and it was right after we'd won the major athletic tournament, so things were pretty exciting. In all the information sessions, they'd be like, oh, and by the way, we just won a national championship, so it seems like people were really proud to go to this school. Okay, so remember, inductive coding is looking at our data and taking ideas right from the data. So it might make sense to go even just sentence by sentence and try to identify codes if there's any sort of meaning in the data to come up with your own list of codes that come out of this. All right. So I'm going to give everybody probably at least 5 minutes to take a look at this, take notes on your own side, and then we'll have a discussion about some of the codes that came up out of this data for you. And then we'll do this again with a coding, with a theoretical framework in mind. All right, so take about 30 more seconds to come up with anything, and then we'll compare notes on what people found. And there's no right or wrong answers here. All right.
Dr. Smith, are we sharing on the meeting chat?
I think it would actually be helpful to have a discussion if people don't mind speaking up. What are some themes that, or what are some codes that came up for you? For anybody?
I wrote one code would be visiting the college.
Okay. Excellent.
I had, in addition to that, you mentioned going to athletics and
It's a little noisy. I heard visiting the college. I heard athletics.
Parent influence.
Parent influence. Okay.
I mentioned school pride.
School pride. Okay.
High school counselor influence.
Okay.
I put strategy.
Tell me what you mean by that.
It seems like there was there could be like a recruitment strategy, right? To be very intentional about the major athletic tournament that everyone was talking about it, but also that it seems that the student was strategic in trying to figure out what would increase their chances to get into a good college. So there to me, I kind of took that as like there's some strategizing there.
Okay. It sounds like strategy almost both on the student's behalf and maybe about how the university is presenting itself.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I had done like recruitment strategy and then just student strategy.
Okay, good.
I had something similar, Nick. I had like ease of the application process.
Okay.
I also had application process and institutional marketing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I had public university, that was the primary one, and publicity and promotion.
From the university? Publicity and promotion. Okay. So it seems like a few folks are sort of tapping into that recruitment, publicity, strategy from an institutional perspective. Good.
And a beautiful campus.
Okay. So that relates to that first one of visiting the campus. Good.
I also had like prestige or reputation when the students had good college.
Okay.
Related to that, I said selectivity, so being part of a selective institution.
Mm-hmm. Does the participant say selective institution?
It says selective public.
Yes, selective. Oh no. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. That's implied, and this person is at a selective institution. Those in the brackets, those were institutional names that I just sort of masked. But
I mean, I kind of got selectivity from like I somehow I got in, right? So there's sort of like a shock factor. So I mean, I put shock as another code, but even to the fact that like I also put selectivity, I kind of just got that from just the tone, and it's hard to retone, but like just sort of like the way that they're describing what happened.
Yeah,
okay.
I sort of, since I want a good college, I want to increase my chances to get anywhere, to get in anywhere since I want a good college.
Exactly.
Actually, to Nick's point with regards to the student indicating that they were surprised that they got in, I actually kind of coded that as gamble because of the way in which the student drew the conclusion to actually apply and consider the other institution and kind of weighing the odds and considering what criteria was needed to apply. So I coded that as a gamble.
Okay. These are great.
Would you add to the gamble that it might just be a fact of choice made by being accepted? In other words, I could apply to 10, but I got accepted to this one. So that's why I made my choice.
Almost like a valuable option, or so you might be limited by that, by the decision. These are great. So we're both looking at ideas that are explicitly said and also sort of implied, like that comment about the selectivity, which I think we've got enough context here to make a conclusion that seems like something that's valuable to this participant, but they don't actually say it. That's what we're reading when we're seeing good college, for instance, is almost how that's being defined implicitly. Excellent.
Now, I have a question about the process for inductive coding.
Yes.
Do you look at all of your interviews and then choose the coding that comes up the most with inductive coding? Or how do you make a choice? Are you going to end up with so many codes? But if you do inductive, it looks as if you're going to end up with a lot of different codes. So how do you distinguish, or like just cut it off? Like, when do you know?
Great question. And you will. You'll end up with a long, long list of codes. We probably came up with 20 even just for this small segment of data. And so that question that Nick asked about, do you develop your code book after the fact or as you go along? And you have to develop your code book as you go along. So for instance, I heard a couple different codes related to campus visits or being a beautiful campus. So maybe as I go along, I recognize that some of these ideas are related, and when I'm defining what my codes are, then I include that in my criteria of what this code matches and what it doesn't. So sometimes you're even broadening your code. So I might start with visiting the campus, but then maybe I'm also seeing that it's the participants commenting on there being a beautiful campus. So maybe my code is just campus. And then anytime campus is referenced, then that's going to fit in a number of different places. So as you go along, you're constantly negotiating of how specific or how general your codes are based on the data. And sometimes you'll find that you're using the same code a lot, again and again and again. And sometimes that means you have to go back and almost be more specific or break it down into ideas that more accurately capture all of the things that are going on related to that main idea that you're pulling out. All right, I thought that was an excellent list and a good start. And these are some of the things that had come up for me when I did this. So also trying to balance representing the data and having enough codes that show some sort of complexity, but also not too many. So I said multiple colleges, so sort of this process of deciding between more than one option as something that I might code for. The influence of others, so I heard folks say parental influence or school counselor influence, so maybe I'm just coding that as anytime somebody else has an influence on the student's decision, that was a code that I could use. Or I might differentiate them, especially if this is appearing a lot within the data. Campus visits, the application process in terms of the logistics, the timeline, or the process. And then also positive college attributes, like being a good college or valuing prestige, or this participant also used words like cool and exciting. And you can see some places where these show up in the data as I tried to code them. And there's overlap. There are some places where multiple codes might apply. And you too will experience that as you code your own data. Sometimes a segment of data has multiple codes attached to it. So for instance, that last segment of the student's response of loving the campus, this whole thing is about positive college attributes of liking the campus and liking this energy surrounding this athletic victory. But also because it happened while they were on campus, these two things do overlap in that case. Okay, so based on some of the codes that we just came up with, how would we answer the research question? How do undergraduate students decide where to attend college? Again, we're just looking at this tiny little segment of data for one person, but what are some of the main things that stand out for how we would actually answer this question?
Based on influence from their college counselors and parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good.
Along with how they feel about the campus and the institutional community,
mm-hmm.
as well as the application process, and if they felt encouraged to apply.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a lot of these things sort of coming together to influence this process. Okay, good. So now let's add a theoretical framework. So the theoretical framework that I picked for this is the ILO model of college going decisions and trajectories. Some of you may have heard of me talking about this because I rather like it, but essentially there's a long history of theory related to college choice. And in 2018, a scholar of higher education, Constance Ilho, developed this model of college-going decisions and trajectories that's meant to be sort of a critical response to existing models related to college choice that are very linear and assume sort of a traditional profile of a student who might be going to college. When in reality, many students going to college today are not of a traditional age, for instance, and may not be going on the timeline that we imagine, and may be the first in their families to attend, or may hold other identities that are underrepresented within the academy. So this theoretical framework, this model, highlights how diverse prospective students make decisions about their higher education pathways. And in particular, there are 3 different forces that interact and overlap in order to shape students' decisions, or rather in shaping students' decisions to attend college and where to attend. So these 3 major pieces of this model are information, time, and opportunity. So information, there is great variety in the quality and amount of information about colleges that students have access to. And access to multiple sources of credible information tends to lead to more informed decisions. So when students are making the decision to attend college, they may have a wide spectrum of information about what college is and about specific colleges in general. The second piece of this model is time, and this could refer to really any sort of perspective of time. So social, educational, and historical events that have occurred in a person's life to lead to a particular college decision or path. So for instance, graduating high school might be an impetus for one person, losing a job might be an impetus for another person, even just driving by a billboard on a highway every single day is something that where time is interacting with higher education or exposure to higher education that might ultimately influence a student's decision to attend school and where to attend. And then the last piece of this is opportunity. So both the perceived and the real opportunity that a student has to attend college and to attend a specific college. So oftentimes a person's identity, their life experiences, their family, their educational history, geography, finances, technology, all of these things that make up a person's experience and identity influence whether a prospective student believes that college or a specific college is right for them or even attainable. So college-going decisions are an ongoing interplay of these 3 components according to this model. All right, so now I want you to code the same set of data with these 3 ideas in mind: information, time, and opportunity. So when you're reading the data, you are looking for instances where information is relevant, where time is relevant, or where opportunity is relevant. So here's that same content again, and your working code book where you have information as a code, time as a code, and opportunity as a code. So I'll give you a few minutes to do this again with coding for these ideas, okay? Go ahead. All right, let's do about 30 more seconds and then we'll come together here. All right, so where within these data do we see instances of information as a code?
I put parental guidance and even the college counselor guidance as information.
Good.
I also put visiting because although, you know, it may not seem direct, but indirectly you're gathering information about the campus by visiting. And also looking at the essay prompts, because that's, I feel like, a way of gathering information that would be required of the student.
Okay. Okay.
Flipping through the college book, something I read up on.
Okay, good.
Just even about multiple colleges, applying all these different colleges, having information on each one.
The
college counselor.
Okay, good.
Attending the information sessions.
Okay. So it sounds like this, based on what all that was just listed, this is a student who's getting information from a lot of different places, a lot of different sources. Okay. Where do we see time come up?
Deadline.
Okay.
And I also had put about, I'm trying. Oh, the line in the second prompt about wanting to increase my chances. I had put chances as related to time, in the sense that, like, if you're kind of scrambling, or like the student said in December, that's a time related. It's a time related issue.
Good. Good.
Even also with the essay, I'm thinking about time as well, because that's something that she already had. So
I went back and forth on this, but I also had the sports tournament as time.
I agree. This is a recent event that just happened. Excellent. Okay. How about opportunity?
So for me, this wasn't like an in vivo code, but it was just idea of like self-worth as an opportunity. The student saying I was just applying to colleges, not really actually thinking about their own self-worth. And so when you're just applying just to see where you can get in, it's a kind of a perceived opportunity or a person's identity as it relates to college choice.
Okay.
I had down the phrase that the student says, I threw in an application and somehow I got in.
Explain how that fits opportunity.
Well, I think that it was almost like the student was taking a chance.
Okay.
And it became a real opportunity when she got accepted.
Okay.
I think too the phrase "increase my chances to get in anywhere" would fit with opportunity.
Okay.
I think someone said about time being like the essay prompts, and I had put essay prompts as opportunity because I think that's when a student can explore their identity and putting that into paper.
And I think that does intersect with time in terms of the fact that they've already done some writing, so they have the opportunity to apply on that limited time frame because of the work already done.
Which I had sports, I ended up deciding time, but I thought it could also be opportunity as a chance for the student to be a part of the excitement and the pride.
Okay.
I put visits as information and opportunity because they had the opportunity to actually go and look at a bunch of different campuses.
Yes. Yep. Good.
Dr. Smith, I have a question about your choice with your theoretical framework.
Mhm.
For example, your theoretical framework actually came with these three categories all set up for you, and quite easily would be easy to transcribe or fit the questions.
Mhm.
After you made your choice for the theoretical framework, was that when you made the decision on the questions? I mean, it's sort of like which came first, the hen or the egg? Like, did you choose the theoretical framework, and then from there, your questions for the interviewee became a part based on this framework?
That's a great question. So the first thing you want is the research questions.
Yeah.
Then you pick your theory, and your theory should indeed help you develop your interview protocol, because you want to elicit information that will tell you whether or not this participant's experience aligns with existing research and existing theory. Mm-hmm. So, yes.
Okay. Because I'm trying to come up with how this fits with both my theoretical framework as well as the conceptual framework, which is quite key for qualitative studies.
Mm-hmm. So you'll want to pick out some of the main ideas that show up in your theoretical framework, it sounds like, and your conceptual framework, and looking for those in the data. And assuming you're doing a blended approach, which I imagine most folks will, that might be how you start, and then you also want to sort of approach the data fresh to see if there's any other ideas that are not being captured. So even in this, even when we looked for these three codes, we're still seeing nuance within each of these codes, right? We could even break these down further. And we're working with such a small bit of data that we don't really need to. But you can imagine having pages and pages of this, and then we might start to define information differently. So maybe we're comparing credible sources and non-credible sources, or we're comparing family influences versus more formal information coming from a school or coming from an institution. Also, when you all gave examples of opportunity, the way in which opportunity was being interpreted varied pretty dramatically based on the different examples that we heard. So even though we're using these three main ideas that come from this framework, we can even start to discern them a little bit further. So these are some of the places that I saw these ideas come out of the data. And again, there was also a lot of overlap too. So for instance, that whole last bottom paragraph, I thought that was all information, but we also see elements of time weaved in, and we see the opportunity for the student visiting the campus. Even just the ability of a student to throw in an application at the last minute is an opportunity, especially because a lot of college applications require you to also submit a payment with your application, and that is assuming that the student has those resources available. So based on that process that we just did, we might have different answers to this research question of how do undergraduate students decide where to attend college, especially if we had a lot more data than we do. So the more data that we have, the more different our answers would have been for the inductive coding and the deductive coding. But even with that small bit of data, you can see how the two answers were different and how we looked at the data differently when we had some of these ideas that were guiding us. So I know we're coming up on 1 hour. I'll just take a few minutes to talk about how this might apply to your work and the approach that you should all take. So again, coming back to this list of steps that happen in the qualitative research process, you really have to spend a lot of time on conducting your literature review and identifying an appropriate theoretical lens in order to decide what types of concepts are going to be most important to the study and to the research questions that you are asking. So ultimately, the role in theory in qualitative research is it is the researcher's job to situate their own work within what's already known, within existing literature, within existing theory, and to describe how existing work influences the research design and methodology. So essentially the theory provides somewhat of a grounding base or an anchor for the study, and it ultimately influences the methods and the analysis. So the theory, like we said a little bit earlier, should influence the way in which you are constructing an interview protocol, for instance, if you are collecting data via interviews. So theory really helps to provide a lens that shapes what is looked at, what questions are asked, and also how data are interpreted. So there are a number of different metaphors for the role of theory in qualitative research. One of them I like is the spotlight, right? When you're studying a topic, there's a lot going on always, but what your theory helps you to do is it helps you narrow down and focus on one part of this experience, phenomenon, event, whatever it is that you're studying, to help draw your attention to some of the ideas that we would expect to be important based on your research questions. In doing so, theory can also create darkness in other areas that we may not be paying attention to, and that's why it can be helpful to combine both inductive and deductive coding. So to not only use ideas from your theory, but to be open to other insights as well. And so because of this theory serving as a way to focus your attention in analysis, different theories give you different perspectives on the same issue. So I always get asked, how do I find a theory? This, I wish there was an easy answer to, and there is not. So I apologize, but this is just a matter of reading and reading and reading. So read research related to your topic. When I'm reading on a new topic and I'm taking notes on what I'm reading, I try to note the theoretical or conceptual frameworks used so I can look into them a little bit more myself. It's helpful to talk to experts in the field about the theories that are important and maybe those that are coming up within the field too, so that you can keep current with some of the newer ideas. It can also be helpful to look to other disciplines specifically. So if your unit of analysis for your research is an individual, you might look to psychology. If your unit of analysis is a group or organization or focuses on how individuals function within a system, you might look at sociology literature. If you're interested in finances, you might look at economics. And then regardless of where your theory comes from, you want to read as much as you can about it. And then it's also wise to look for criticisms of the theories that you choose because all of them are limited in some way. And it's helpful to know what the strengths and limitations of these theories are, especially as you approach your analysis process and are open to different types of insights. So in sum, the steps to a deductive coding process are to read. Based on your reading, you want to identify some important ideas from the literature and a relevant framework. You want to identify then key concepts that come out of that framework and or that comes out of the literature that relate to your research questions so that you can look for these ideas within your data. So you want to develop that list of a priori codes, just like we did with the time, information, opportunity, to see and locate where these ideas and how these ideas show up within your data. So you're creating a code book where you're using these words as a code and you're also defining them and making rules for yourself about when they apply and when they do not apply. And then you conduct analysis. You systematically analyze your data to apply a priori codes. So I have a couple example studies here, and again, I can share this PowerPoint with anybody who wants it so that you can come back and look at this. But this is an example of one study where the results are presented based on the theoretical model that guides this study. And then I have another example on here of a study that took a blended coding approach and is very explicit about what their coding looked like. And what I like about this particular paper is that there's an appendix to it where you can actually see the researchers' interview protocol, so you can see how they constructed the questions that they asked their participants, and you can also see their list of codes, and they differentiate between which codes were a priori, so those that they use in the deductive process, and those that came inductively out of their separate analysis. So these are the references that showed up earlier in this presentation, and then there's a million other books, articles about qualitative research, about the analysis process, about theory and the role of theory in qualitative data. If you're interested in inductive coding, since probably everybody will do some level of inductive coding, grounded theorists offer a really nice and commonly cited perspective on how to approach inductive coding processes. And then I've just got some links to some other resources as well.